Iowa City Foreign Relations Council hosts community programs to address topics of international interest. We thank our members, our volunteers, and interns for making these forums possible since 1983, which was the year that Lotus 123 was released. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge our university and community supporters for their financial support. The University of Iowa's International Programs, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa Center for Public Policy, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization. I also want to thank today's special sponsors, Midwest One Bank, and Denise, Dave, and Mike Tiffany. Also, I would like to thank City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for cablecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2, and the UI Library's digital archives. Over 200 Iowa City Foreign Relations Council podcasts can now be found on iTunes. It is now my pleasure to introduce John Reitz, who is a professor in the UI School of Law, and he will be introducing our speaker. John?
Thank you, Karen. And it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Chris Rossi. He directs Humanities at Iowa, but he's also been teaching for the law school for many, many years, and we've had a chance to at least collaborate informally and exchange ideas about international law for a long time. Chris has his Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and law degrees from the University of London and the University of Iowa. He worked on deterrence issues for the Arms Control Association, a division of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and on verification issues at the UN International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. He's also taught at American University, UNI, the Mongolian Diplomatic Institute, and Pusan National University in South Korea. He served on the White House National Security Council as Director of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, and he has published a lot of very good articles and on law of war, legal history, international courts and criminal tribunals, polar affairs, Latin America, and the law of the sea. And he has co-edited 2 books on international affairs and has authored 3 books himself, the latest titled Sovereignty and Territorial Temptation, Cambridge University, 2017. So you can see he's got a lot of ideas, and I'm really glad he's here to share some of them with us. But I'm actually most jealous of the last thing I'll mention, which is he edited a chapbook for folks here in Iowa on the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery Expedition, which was distributed to 20,000 fifth grade students of Iowa history. So with that, my great pleasure to introduce Chris Rossi.
I've never done a PowerPoint presentation before, so I've kept my images to 3 or 4, just in case I screw this up. Well, let me introduce you to the subject matter of this conversation today. You can see it prominently featured in this first slide. I'd like you to meet the Nile Perch, or Mbuta, as it is called, in the Great Lakes region of Africa. You see that the Nile Perch is a beast, and it is attracting worldwide attention from anglers and sports people who come to hunt this fish and probably mount it when they're not eating it. You see also behind the photograph is an image of a body of water. That water is Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria is the second largest freshwater lake in the world. It is the largest tropical lake in the world, and it is the greatest of the Great Lakes in Africa. So you might wonder and ask yourself, why is the Nile perch, named after the Nile River, whence it came, why is it being fished out of Lake Victoria? And the answer to that question is that in the 1950s, probably, Ugandan game and fishing officials put some Nile perch into Lake Victoria to accomplish exactly what this image suggests. It attracted fishermen, it attracted commerce, it provided engaging occupation for local guides, and it was incredibly successful. So much so that now this great lake is being threatened by the Nile Perch. It is a devastating piscivore. It eats everything save for 3 species in the lake, and it has caused such mayhem that there is serious ecological concern for the future of the lake, which is an industrious region for 30 million people around its shore. So this is a human-made problem, made with the best of intentions, that is currently creating more of a problem than anybody previously imagined. But the situation in the story takes an odd turn. Lake Victoria is also receding, and the waters that are so abundant in this great catchment area of Africa is causing yet another concern that is directly attributable to climate change. So another human-caused circumstance is adding an ecological element to this area that is causing the water table to recede. That recession is creating opportunity at the same time that it is causing nightmares for geographers, geologists, hydrographers, and people who wonder about why this phenomenon is taking place. Let me introduce you to Migingo. As far back as anybody could remember, Migingo was nothing more than an uninhabited pinprick on Lake Victoria. It is one of 3 small islands in the eastern waters that make up an island chain. Migingo is barely half the size of the University of Iowa Hawkeye football field, and yet it is home to now, at times, 1,000 people, 4 hotels, a pharmacy, and other accoutrements, both sacred and profane, including a whole host of pirates that populate this area and these waters. It measures about 1/2 acre, or about 2,000 square meters. In 2001, some resourceful fishermen began using Migingo as an offshore way station because the islet just happens to be more habitable than the steeply sloped adjoining islets that form the archipelago. And because the fishermen who came to Migingo began earning 3 to 4 times in a day what shore-based fishermen could earn in a month, word soon spread that Migingo's geographic location made it ideally suitable to hunting the Nile perch. The Nile perch is now studied as one of the most invasive species in the history of our world. It has brought unbelievable attention to this area, including the fishermen who now use the craggy, receding shore that is exposed by the water table going down as a place to park their boats. Beforehand, before 2001, nobody could really do that. And why would you anyway? This island here is about 3 hours by boat ride from Kenya, and it's about 11 or 12 hours from Uganda. So it's not an easy ride to get there. But you need to get there in order to hunt the Nile perch, and the rewards have been phenomenal. To make this situation a little bit more complicated, Kenya is ideally suited to processing this fish. Even though Kenya owns 6% of Lake Victoria, it is generating the lion's share of income from this industry. Uganda owns 46 to 48% of Lake Victoria and is generating only a minuscule amount of income from this industry. That has created some problem with regard to the equities involved here. this area is not a rich area. And this industry is now approaching, from this little island and other places, about $500 million worth of income for these fisher people. And this is a serious, serious means for sustaining life in an area that is off the beaten track in certain respects. So, you can see from this not very official but nevertheless effective map of line drawing that Migingo straddles the water borderline between Uganda and Kenya. And that's the problem. Who owns Migingo? Well, that depends on where the line falls. The meridian line, of course, has a long and textured provenance, and we can look to the British to help us tell that story, as we will. But this image here, which is not official, would certainly be very pleasing to anybody here from Kenya, because the borderline seemingly suggests that the archipelago itself falls completely within the waters of Kenya. Ugandans disagree. Ugandans point out that the borderline itself is supposed to touch the western point of Pyramid Island. As drawn here, it seemingly suggests that the borderline does touch the western point of Pyramid Island. But Ugandans will tell you that Migingo was a generic term to describe the archipelago. It was never specifically attached to Migingo as portrayed in this image. Actually, so say the Ugandans, the farthest western point of Pyramid Island is Migingo Island, which is misnamed. The Ugandans claim that Migingo Island is the border point, and they have a compelling reason for saying this. Migingo looks like Pyramid Island. It looks like a pyramid, so they say. This is the problem. Where did this line come from? What does it mean? So, in looking at this issue, you have to know a little bit about how Africa became Africa in terms of its cartographic arrangement. And to tell that story, you actually have to go back to the Americas, because the Americas contributed the international legal principle that was imported to Africa to draw African lines and then exported again to Asia, where, in retrospect, we can see that every border dispute relating to where a line is owes its origin to imperialism or to colonization, or if you prefer, to the Spanish. Spain had a 300-year empire in the Americas. It ended in 1810. It began to end in 1810, and it ended completely in 1824 if you discount the middle points of the 19th century when the Spanish tried to come back and then come back again in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. But the Spaniards left basically in 1824, and they left a curious arrangement that delineated space and topography according to imprecise characterizations. These characterizations spanned things like the Andes. It spanned deserts like the Atacama, which is a hyper-arid region of the world that is second only to the dry valleys of Antarctica in terms of lack of rain. There's no habitation in many parts of this area, and yet Spain, the 16th century Spanish mindset created maps that put borderlines between their viceroyalties or their subaltern municipalities or administrative agencies to promote empire. When they left, there was a huge vacuum as to how the new republics that formed, and there were 13 of them, along with Brazil, which was actually a monarchy when it began, but there were 14 new political entities to carve up the Spanish Empire, and to do so, they employed a Roman law principle called uti possidetis. Sounds funny, but we pay the price for this importation from Roman law today. Uti possidetis essentially says that the power that is in charge, when the preceding power leaves, takes possession of the territory. It's like taking a snapshot of where the imperial powers were and then drawing a line and saying to the subsequent powers, that's the borderline. This was the principle that was imported to Africa after the American republics began to form. And it was a proposition that had a degree of economic efficiency attached to it, but it also had a tremendous amount of human consequence. If you know something about nomos, if you know something about space, if you know something in the humanities that people refer to as a sense of place, if you think about the Greek notion of topophilia, the idea that people associate and have deep attachments to the land from which they come, you know that people aren't easily removed from the identity that is created by their spatial worldview. But spatial worldviews were imported to Africa by this kind of Euclidean geometry that Europeans were very good at thinking about. But if you know something about the kinds of the topophilia, if you know something about the African way of dealing with space, you will understand that African conceptions of space are not Euclidean. They involve networks of religion, commerce, history, language, ethnicity, and identity that overlap and blur borderlands. African spatial identity is porous and pluralistic. It never conformed to the idea that was imputed and imported to the space by the Europeans. As you fly into Iowa City, you look down at the precision by which the grid was made to accommodate the Iowa conception of space. It probably has something to do with farmers not liking bends and diagonals and curves. But this is not really the way in which the African mindset worked. And so this problem, which actually is behind many kinds of problems all around the world, and even in the United States. Remember, in our history, when we drew our lines to conform our sovereignty to the space that we own, the original distinction that the British imposed was that the white men could not jump over the Appalachians. That was the division line, until the Northwest Ordinance allowed for the domination of new space that actually got in the way of many Aborigines in America. That remains part and parcel of America's conversation with the way in which we obtained our space. Aside from that, the Northwest, the Oregon Territory, was completely left open because no one knew where to draw the line. And the Jay Treaty in the United States in 1794 meant to address the northeast boundary around the Bay of Fundy, differentiating British New Caledonia from Maine, or what was to be Maine. There are lots of places in the world where the geostrategic cartography cannot overlay completely the pluralistic meanderings of human beings. And in the 19th century, when the Europeans decided to take over Africa, and they did, they decided at a conference in Berlin in the 1880s to divide Africa. And they did it very successfully, and the atlas of today conforms very much to the line drawing of the 19th century done by the Europeans at the Berlin Conference. And we can thank King Leopold of Belgium for convening that. He didn't really convene it, but what he did was he decided he was going to take a colony, and he did. And the Belgian Congo basically subsumed 450 identities in Central Africa, and it created for the Belgians, which never had a colony, and King Leopold II wanted a colony, it created this great land space for the Belgians. And it was such an accomplishment for the king that he never thought that it was necessary to go visit his colony, which today, if you read about the history of the Belgian takeover of the Congo, you will see that it equates with the Nazi Holocaust in terms of human consequence. Maybe even, not that it matters, but when you get into the millions, but it certainly may even surpass the number of people killed and put into servitude for that purpose. Not one African was at that conference. Nobody from Africa indigenously knew what the consequences were to be. But the imputation and the importation of uti possidetis made that division perfectly sensible. And that's how the Europeans ended their scramble for Africa, using international legal principles of a Euclidean nature to delineate space according to a sensibility that did not comport with or even involve those people most seriously and directly affected. So became our construction of Africa. Now, with regard to Migingo, the British wanted very much to move into this area for fear that the Germans would do so from the south otherwise. And then you had the Portuguese moving in from the Atlantic as well. And you had the French up in the Maghreb. And you even had the Italians over in Ethiopia. So there were all these incursions into the central portion of Africa, and the British needed to figure out a way to control this area so that they could then move up into the Suez Canal area and make sure that they could control commerce into the Mediterranean. To do that, they needed to draw some lines. And in drawing the lines relating to Migingo, they encountered a problem. First of all, the line drawing was never complete in this area, but railroads began to become a very important component to colonization. And the British knew that the best way to get into the interior, having had Stanley and other explorers, John Speke, for instance, moving into this area, they reported back what was available, what was there, and it was all necessarily important to take. So the British decided to build a railroad, and they built this railroad, which is an engineering masterpiece from the port of Mombasa in Kenya inward, 600 miles inward, a slender thread of scientific civilization drawn across the primeval chaos of the world. That was what Winston Churchill wrote in his description of this rail line, which he took, and he marveled at how the British could make this rail line so deep into the chaos, primeval chaos of the world. Well, in making this railroad, there was a man who was the surveyor and the sort of organizer of British interests in East Africa. His name is Sir Clement Hill. Sir Clement Hill had the idea that in order to capture administrative efficiency, the railroad line itself needed to be part of one administered territory. The problem with that was that the kingdom of Buganda got in the way. The Bugandans owned, if you will, a sizable portion of East Africa in what is now called the Rift Valley, and their kingdom and their administration got in the way with the Kenyan protectorate system. But they weren't the only ones. The Maasai were involved with their pluralistic worldview that didn't subscribe to rail lines as straight as they were, as Euclidean as they could be. The Nandi, the Lumbwa, the Kavronda, the Luo, all of these identities and people were situated along with the kingdom of Buganda in this area from Mombasa over to the eastern shore of Lake Victoria. And they had to be moved. and Sir Clement Hill, with one stroke of a pen, declared and gifted this huge portion of the East African Rift Valley to Kenya as a protectorate, and he gave the Bugandans a mighty fine haircut. In doing so, all of these other forces had to be pacified. They had to be moved. They had to be expelled, and they were. But the pacification process that the British used in the 20th century resulted in violence in 1900. In 1903, pacification efforts and British troops were sent to this area again in 1905, 1906, 1911, 1912, 1914, 1915, and 1917. It was a tremendously violent exchange between imperial powers and ethnicities based upon the need to consolidate territory under one simple administrative rule motivated by a railroad. After that happened, World War I intervened, and then in 1926, after the Great War, the British issued an order in council, which set the line. But the line itself had this confusing component to it. It had the ordinances that would suggest that the line might be here as suggested, but it also had this confusing phrase that it was the western point of Pyramid Island that nobody really defined, which was the terminus for this division. And it was that confusing division that resulted in this dispute. In 2008, Ugandans started populating Migingo with great numbers. And that precipitated a response from Kenya. So before too long, you had Ugandan Marines facing Kenyan policemen with ethnicities involved in the fishing trade in a very tiny area. And in many ways, it has been restricted to that kind of cold, frozen dispute ever since. However, in 2008, the Migingo situation got out of hand. And the Kenyans were brutally treated by the Ugandans. And in response, the Kenyan populations in the Great Rift Valley decided to uproot the railroad. They did. That slender, what do you call it? A slender thread of scientific civilization was uprooted by rioters. And that put an end to 80% of Uganda's trade to the world. So the Ugandans saw this as an attack as an existential attack against its entire economy. Not to mention that Rwanda, the Central African Republic, and Burundi also linked to the rail line that egresses into the Indian Ocean and the rest of the world through Mombasa. It was a major statement by the Kenyans about how they have a stranglehold over these Central African economies based upon a conversation about who owns Migingo. The problem with that is that the Kenyans don't speak with one tongue. The Kenyans have all of these diasporatic communities left over from the division of the Great Rift Valley, wanting back their property that they were forcibly expelled from by Sir Clement Hill's decision to draw a line. And those communities remember and have long identities about mistreatment among themselves. For instance, the Luo and the Kikuyu are very much part of this story in that their ethnic tensions create big problems for Kenya. The Kenyan response to this rioting, precipitated by this island problem, eventually resulted in such treatment that the Kenyan government was was brought before the International Criminal Court under suspicions that it was engaging in acts of genocide. These ethnic problems created by all of this movement was brought to the attention of the International Criminal Court from the special prosecutor, herself an African, but her identification of the leadership of Kenya as the source of the genocidal activity against these populations resulted in the Kenyan government making a claim that the International Criminal Court was an international Caucasian court directed against the interests of justice by white people from Europe who were writing the subtext to the conversation that resulted in criminal prosecutions only against African leaders and not against other genocidal activity elsewhere in the world that might have to do with Europe or the American presence. So the situation now results in a very uncomfortable arrangement where if you try to solve the problem by figuring out where this line really goes, you're going to have to move the line. And what everybody who has to do with owning or regulating countries agrees upon generally is that you don't want to move the lines. The lines are here to stay. Now, in individual circumstances, we can always talk about moving the line. But generically, once you move one line, it's connected to another line, and then it's connected to another line. And the very idea that you can move lines opens up the idea that maybe the porosity of human life and human geography is more the measure by which the line should have been drawn in the first place. Well, that's too much for international law to bear. And let me and there's some complicity that needs to be directed toward the leaders of Africa. African leaders have engaged in forms of patrimonialism. Ethnographers, anthropologists sometimes refer to this as the big man syndrome, which, by the way, has most recently been applied to President Trump. It has. But this idea of engaging in fealty and of service based upon ethnic relationships or based upon economic ties or patrimony or heritage or some sort of cliquish behavior is one that African leaders fully understand. And also the idea that the Africans themselves in 1960 made a deal with the devil. Or alternatively put, they made a deal with Uti Posititis. They wrote into their organic charter the idea that lines will never be moved again. They bought into the principle that the Europeans put on top of Africa because even though it created this huge human drama and all of these inequities and all of this huge diaspora, it nevertheless consolidated power among those people who were in power at the time that the African charter was solidified. So there were gains to be had by the parochial leadership in Africa over just taking whatever the borderlines were so that they could consolidate power. And so nobody wants to move this line anymore, although nobody can abide by the line. Now, you might think that the formal solution, the rational solution, would be some sort of condominium. And that is, in a way, what we have here, although we certainly have pirates, and we certainly have mayhem, and we certainly have a game of brinksmanship going on. But when you get beyond that, and I invite you to try, what you have is the understanding that these Nile Perch, or actually the great catchment of Lake Victoria, is a resource that needs to be shared by multiple entities. And rationalism suggests that everybody needs to get along here, whether we like each other or not, for fear that we're going to kill this goose that's laying this golden egg. There are patterns for this that you could look to. The Mediterranean Sea has some of the most argumentative personalities and cultures facing each other from the rich north and the poor south, from the great traditions of the book. The Jews, the Christians, the Muslims are all there. And yet they all recognize that the Mediterranean basin is something that needs to be protected for the benefit of all. And that's the kind of condominium arrangement that hopefully can result were rationalism to prevail. But against this drama and against all that is at stake and against the adulterations to our climate that humans have perhaps caused, the number of movable parts in this equation suggests that perhaps it needs to be frozen or kept at this impasse until an indigenous source, such as the African Union, can more appropriately discuss this issue. With, as a little sidebar, with regard to the fate of the International Criminal Court in Africa, there is a tremendous amount of conversation about how it is lopsidedly oriented toward the persecution of black people and of by white people. But the response to the idea of getting rid of the International Criminal Court has been most vociferously felt in black Africa, which says, no, atrocities need to be accounted for. And we need to have this institution ourselves. So the civil society elements within black Africa are saving the International Criminal Court from itself. Whether this can somehow serve as a lesson for what's going on in Migingo, I don't know, but the story is actually unfolding every day. And it is very new. It's very rare that you can look at a situation that began in about 2008 and 10 years later talk about, we're getting by we've had examples of riots, war talk, we've had major disruptions to economies, all within 10 years over a little pinprick in Lake Victoria. And so the solutions are perhaps few and far between, and fortunately I don't have to provide any. But the course of this conflict has been derided as Africa's smallest war. And it's a cute little phrase, I admit, but it's not a small war. It is indicative of centuries of problems relating to the idea of sovereign state control over interstitial areas that are dominated by human complexity. It's not Africa's smallest war. It's humanity's eternal problem. Thank you.
Several of our astute members in the audience have asked you to make some comparisons to the Chinese dispute now, and I suppose one simple way of asking the question is why don't the Ugandans build an island there? Is that something they're trying to do?
There's a real problem of capital here. I mean, getting the resources together to build things out in this area require a lot of money. And the Chinese have a lot of money, and they are building structures like the ones possibly suggested in the South China Sea. But it's an excellent question about the relationship between this issue and the South China Sea. For those of you who don't know, the South China Sea is the 5th largest body of water in the world. It accounts for $1 trillion of trade every year. And the Chinese have drawn a line. By the way, they've drawn a dotted line. Around 90% of this water, and they very ambiguously refer to it as part of China's historic rights, its historic title, its historic destiny even. They refuse to say that they own the water for fear of what would happen, but they've come very close to making that claim. And they base it on what in law we call effectivité. It is the historical circumstances, the Chinese government, those octogenarians in the Great Hall of the People, they're looking to what happened 2,000 years ago in their dynastic tradition, and they're making this claim that we've always owned it. How could you possibly think that we didn't own it? Well, probably because you got Mekong dynasties, you have Cambodian dynasties, you have the Philippines, you have Malaysians, you have Indonesians, you have all kinds of dynastic traditions in this area. Why should we think that your tradition is the one that dominates? Particularly because in the 15th century, the Chinese, through Confucian handlers, decided to pull back their entire outward orientation. And for hundreds of years, the Chinese never ventured anywhere outside of China. You know why? Because they had, you think that the South America has border problems. You take a look at China. China has major border problems, and they've had to consolidate their claims, and to an extent they already have, but now they are claiming that their historical tradition grants them some sort of almost sovereign rights to this sea. They may get away with it. They may get away with it. You know, just like the United States. Sorry to make this comparison. It wasn't part of the question. But I do remember that the United States made big claims in the Caribbean. And it was all due to the control over the Panama Canal. This is, you know, within the generation of many people here's grandparents. The 20th century, in the 2012 or something, the Panama Canal comes about. The United States needed to protect the Caribbean, and then it needed to protect the Pacific base. You know, so shortly thereafter, the United States annexes Hawaii. In addition, and shortly before that, the United States beats up on Spain, takes over Cuba, establishes a protectorate, the Platt Amendment in 1901. And then it extends the Platt Amendment with a Lodge Corollary, forbidding Germans and Japanese to have bases on the Baja. This was all done to, you know, and all of a sudden, under principles of freedom of navigation and commerce, which the Chinese in the South China Sea do not want to monkey with because there's too much money to be made through that kind of arrangement. But as long as the Chinese get to militarily control the commerce and the navigation, then things are all right. Just like the United States through the Panama Canal decided that it needed to do the same. And so the Caribbean for the United States became the springboard for globalism into the Pacific, all the way up to China itself with the Boxer Rebellion. This is a model that, you know, that the Chinese are probably looking for, because if they can control the South China Sea and the Yellow Sea, they're going to control a lot of access to blue water, which is going to contribute to their One Road initiative, which has overland routes, but it also has maritime routes. And they're going around and through those very pirate-infested waters of Malaysia into the Indian Ocean in order to go to India. And then also, if you haven't seen what the Chinese are doing in Africa, you soon will understand that they have tremendous interests in Africa. So the idea that these borders become springboards for something else, and I think I migrated from the question a little bit, but it reminds me of a leitmotif. It reminds me of a series of patterns that great powers are capable of engaging in. And it wouldn't surprise me if the Chinese are able to get away with these things to the extent that others before them have shown a pretty able access to accommodate.
Don't go away. Since you got onto the Chinese, one of our members wanted to know, do the Chinese have any investment in the current dispute? Is there any relationship there?
No, I don't think the Chinese are.
Okay.
They got a big investment in Africa, believe me. But Migingo?
Yeah. Okay. Well, another question is, what about Tanzania? They were on your map. Do they have any stake in this, or have they made any claim in this island?
No, this is a dispute between these two countries. If I knew how to work this thing and go back one, you could see how the... Use the back arrow.
Why not? Let's see if we can figure that out.
There. Yeah.
There you go.
That's why, who needs a PowerPoint anyway? So Tanzania is right here, right? You see that their interests with regard to Tanzania, their interests regard to Migingo fall short. If the latitudinal line, if that line were to change, Believe me, you would hear some Tanzanian complaints. However, there are Tanzanians who are on this island. There are. Most of the businesses are owned by Ugandans, or so they claim. And so the Ugandan Marines who are present require. And taxes are paid to the Kenyans and the Tanzanians to support this industry. But the map itself, if you believe it, deprives the Tanzanians of any complaint.
Okay. You mentioned this problem of violence. I guess, there was violence on both sides, but it sounded like was there a suit in the International Tribunal against Kenya for responding with force, or was it the other way around? Anyway, has there been any rulings in international tribunals about this?
There are lots of rulings in international tribunals about borders. But with regard to this particular case, there has been some saber rattling saying, we're going to take you to the international court. But the parties are not of the will in and of themselves to do this. It seems to be an intramural problem here that they prefer to settle differently if they settle it at all. Problem with taking this to the international court is you're going to get a definitive statement as to which one of these lines, prevails, in which case you'll get a clear-cut loser. And the equities on both sides are such that nobody wants to be declared a clear-cut loser.
Okay. What about the, one question here is about the UN Law of the Sea Convention. Do they provide rules that might be used to resolve this dispute or not?
There's a concept in law called subject matter jurisdiction, ratione materiae. This relates to a non-sea problem. Right. This is a lake, freshwater lake. However, there are most certainly general principles of boundary delimitation that apply both in the sea and on land. But those customary principles hinge upon who tells the story of history. Whose history are you going to look to try to figure out what was going on? Both parties, in a way, are mad at the British for imposing their own history. So do you want to go back and just apply the British history? You don't want to apply Sir Clement Hill's idea about what really needs to be done for all these ethnicities? Just get them out of the way? Do you want to apply the Ugandan history? In fact, the Museveni, the president of Uganda, said they were ours. They were ours. In fact, if you recall the misrule of Idi Amin, the former dictator of Uganda, he said at one point they were ours. But any such talk like this only stimulates more saber rattling on the other side. It's not conducive to a solution, and yet forwarding a legal solution is a very, very high-order, mature form of dispute settlement. There are softer versions of law that many times are much more effective, taking things off the front table, getting away from the glare of personality and of the honor associated with things, and solving them in a quieter forum, or maybe just letting things settle down. Might be a good idea. The ultimate good idea is that the demand for this fish is so great that the waters now in Lake Victoria are being overfished, thankfully. And so humanity may provide this solution to the problem by simply getting rid of those fish in this lake, in which case Migingo will go back to its time-tested identity as nothing more than a desolate little island that nobody really wanted to visit anyway.
You mentioned the International Criminal Court and the prosecutor of that court. Can you say a little more about what the implications of this dispute may have been or might be for the International Criminal Court?
A lot of people are worried about the International Criminal Court because it raises serious questions about atrocity accountability. But like many new institutions, it goes through periods of what we can call growing pains, if I can be sort of organic about it. And the emphasis that the criminal court has had on instances of accountability have been oriented heavily toward providing spotlights and solutions on atrocity in Africa. there's plenty of atrocity to go around. But to say that it's a lopsided orientation toward Africa is, in a way, to set up what some people have called a smokescreen. Maybe the functioning of the International Criminal Court is starting to work. Maybe the organic operation is starting to take hold. Traction is being made. It will grow. It is already starting to grow out of its orientation toward Africa. There are elements of this accountability that are now focusing on the situation in Colombia. There are other elements that have oriented toward the Middle East. And so, the idea, this is very problematic in terms of the pressure it puts on the International Criminal Court from an African perspective, but the solutions, as I intimated earlier, are thankfully being provided by African civil society, and alternatively from some smart choices by putting Africans in control in key positions of the International Criminal Court. I had occasion in the 1990s to actually work on the formative procedures to establish the International Criminal Court and ad hoc courts, and some of them actually redounded to something so simple and unfathomable as who's going to pay the electricity to keep the court lights on. That's the nascent first level order of business that we've gone beyond. And so I'm grateful to and hopeful for those civil society organizations in Africa that are going to redeem the human qualities necessary for the continuation of this most important, long overdue institution. But we tread softly, and we argue against those who create smoke screens to dismantle the institution itself.
Okay, that was the last question, so let's thank Chris once more for a great talk. Before we close, let me just thank our supporters one more time. The University of Iowa's International Programs, the University of Iowa's Honors Program, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, along with our special supporters, Midwest One Bank and Dave, Denise, and Mike Tiffany. So now, Chris, as a token of appreciation, I would like to give you the coveted mug for the Foreign Relations Council, if it's here. Thank you.
Thank you.